The lobby of Kingston Global headquarters was alive, with activity from the moment the doors opened. Executives hurried toward elevators while assistants carried stacks of documents and employees discussed million-dollar projects over expensive coffee. Every person entering the building looked polished and confident, dressed in tailored suits that reflected the company's reputation as one of the largest financial firms in the country. Sitting quietly in the corner of the spacious marble lobby was a man who seemed completely out of place. His name was Daniel Brooks, a 36-year-old single father wearing a simple navy jacket, neatly pressed trousers, and shoes that showed signs of years of careful use. Beside him sat his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, wearing her neatly pressed school uniform and holding a small coloring book. Daniel checked the time on his watch and smiled reassuringly at his daughter. "It won't be much longer," he whispered gently. Sophie nodded, trusting every word her father said, even though they had already been waiting for almost 2 hours. The receptionist glanced toward them several times, but never bothered asking whether they needed anything. She simply assumed Daniel was another job applicant waiting for an interview. Throughout the morning, employees walked past the father and daughter without paying much attention. Some looked briefly before continuing toward the elevators. Others quietly whispered among themselves, wondering why a man with a child had chosen to spend the entire morning in the company lobby. Around noon, several senior managers walked through the reception area on their way to lunch. One of them noticed Daniel still sitting patiently in the same chair. "He's still here?" The manager laughed. Another replied, "Maybe he thinks someone important is actually going to meet him." Their laughter echoed through the lobby while Sophie lowered her eyes, pretending not to hear. Daniel simply smiled at his daughter and continued reading a storybook with her as though nothing had happened. Years of raising Sophie alone had taught him that protecting her heart was more important than defending his pride. As the afternoon passed, employees returned from lunch carrying shopping bags and coffee cups. One young executive stopped near Daniel and casually asked, "Are you still waiting?" "Whoever you're meeting must have forgotten about you," Daniel answered politely. "I'm sure they're just busy." The executive chuckled before walking away. Sophie quietly held her father's hand. "Daddy, are they being mean to us?" Daniel gently squeezed her hand and smiled. "Sometimes people judge before they understand. That's why we should always choose kindness." Sophie nodded, even though she didn't fully understand. She had learned that her father never spoke badly about anyone, no matter how unfairly they treated him. By late afternoon, the lobby had become noticeably quieter. The receptionist finally walked over to Daniel with an impatient expression. "Sir, if your appointment has been canceled, you'll have to leave. We close the visitor area soon." Daniel calmly reached into his jacket pocket and removed a simple black envelope. "Would you please give this to Mr. Richard Hayes?" he asked politely. The receptionist looked at the envelope without taking it. "Mr. Hayes is the chief executive officer. He doesn't meet with people without appointments." Daniel smiled kindly. "Please tell him Daniel Brooks is waiting downstairs." Rolling her eyes, the receptionist reluctantly picked up the phone. Only seconds after speaking the name Daniel Brooks, her face lost all color. She immediately stood up from her chair. "One moment. Please don't leave." Less than a minute later, every elevator in the executive wing opened at once. Board members, vice presidents, department directors, and finally CEO Richard Hayes himself hurried across the marble floor toward the lobby. The employees who were still inside the building stopped walking and stared in complete silence. Richard Hayes approached Daniel with respect, extending both hands before speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Mr. Brooks, I sincerely apologize for keeping you waiting." The board meeting lasted much longer than expected. Daniel stood up, smiled warmly, and shook his hand. "No apology is necessary, Richard. I enjoyed spending the day with my daughter." Richard then turned toward little Sophie and smiled. "You must be Sophie. Your father talks about you every time we meet." Sophie smiled shyly. Every employee watching the scene looked completely confused. They had spent the entire day ignoring, judging, and laughing at the quiet single father sitting in the lobby. None of them knew that Daniel Brooks was the anonymous majority owner of Kingston Global, the man whose signature appeared on every executive contract, every company investment, and every single paycheck issued to every employee in the building. As complete silence filled the lobby, Daniel slowly looked around at the faces that had ignored him all day, not with anger but with quiet disappointment. The lesson they were about to learn would change the company forever. The silence inside Kingston Global's lobby was almost overwhelming. Employees who had laughed at Daniel throughout the day stood frozen as CEO Richard Hayes respectfully invited him toward the executive elevators. No one could understand why the most powerful man in the company was treating an ordinary-looking single father with such respect. Daniel gently took Sophie's hand before turning back toward the receptionist. Instead of showing anger, he smiled kindly and said, "Thank you for letting us wait here today." The receptionist lowered her head in embarrassment, unable to look him in the eyes. She remembered ignoring him for hours and assuming he was an unemployed visitor. Now she realized she had judged someone she didn't even know. Daniel and Sophie entered the private elevator with Richard Hayes while dozens of employees watched. The doors slowly close. The whispers began immediately. Everyone wanted to know who Daniel Brooks really was. Inside the executive boardroom, 12 directors stood as Daniel entered the room. Sophie looked around in amazement at the enormous conference table overlooking the city skyline. Richard pulled out the chairman's seat and politely said, "Mr. Brooks, the board has been waiting for your final decision." Daniel smiled and helped Sophie sit beside him before taking his own seat. Every board member treated him with complete respect. One director placed several documents in front of Daniel, who quietly reviewed each page before signing them. Richard then addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to officially welcome the founder and majority owner of Kingston Global, Mr. Daniel Brooks." Although the board already knew his identity, hearing those words spoken aloud reminded everyone of the extraordinary journey behind the quiet man sitting before them. 15 years earlier, Daniel had started the company from a small rented office with nothing more than a laptop, determination, and a dream of creating a business that valued people over profits. As the company grew into a global corporation, Daniel stepped away from public life after his wife passed away unexpectedly. Choosing to focus on raising Sophie, he allowed Richard Hayes to become the public face of Kingston Global, while Daniel remained the anonymous owner behind the scenes. Meanwhile, news of Daniel's identity spread rapidly throughout the headquarters. Employees who had mocked him earlier suddenly remembered every careless word they had spoken. The young executive who joked about Daniel waiting all day sat silently at his desk, realizing he had laughed at the man responsible for his career. The senior managers who had ridiculed him during lunch avoided looking at one another. Even the receptionist struggled to hold back tears as she replayed the day's events in her mind. They had judged a father simply because he wore simple clothes and waited patiently without demanding special treatment. Not one person had offered him a glass of water, a comfortable place for his daughter, or even basic kindness. The following morning, every employee received an email marked mandatory company meeting. Within an hour, the entire workforce gathered in the main auditorium. Excitement and nervousness filled the room as everyone wondered what would happen next. When the lights dimmed, Richard Hayes walked onto the stage and introduced Daniel Brooks for the very first time. The audience immediately stood in complete silence as Daniel walked forward holding Sophie's hand. Looking across the room, he recognized many of the faces that had ignored him only a day earlier. He smiled gently before speaking. "Yesterday, I spent nearly 8 hours sitting in our company lobby. I wasn't testing anyone. I was simply waiting for a meeting that ran longer than expected. During those hours, my daughter and I experienced something that made me very sad, not because people didn't know who I was, but because they believed kindness should depend on who someone is." The room became completely silent. Daniel continued, "Every person who walks through our doors deserves dignity. Whether they are a billionaire, a cleaner, a delivery driver, or someone applying for their very first job, they deserve to be treated with respect. A company's greatest strength is not its buildings or its profits. It is the character of its people." Many employees lowered their heads, realizing his words were directed at all of them. Daniel wasn't speaking with anger. He was speaking with disappointment, and somehow that felt even heavier. By the time he finished, many people in the auditorium understood that the lesson they had learned would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The auditorium remained completely silent after Daniel Brooks finished speaking. Hundreds of employees sat with their heads lowered, reflecting on how they had treated the quiet single father, who had spent the entire day waiting in their lobby. Daniel looked around the room without anger or resentment. He understood that mistakes were part of being human, but he also believed every mistake was an opportunity to become better. After a few moments, he smiled gently and invited Sophie onto the stage. The little girl walked confidently to her father and held his hand. "Yesterday," Daniel said softly, "my daughter asked me if the people in this building were being mean to us. I told her that sometimes people judge before they understand, and that we should always choose kindness anyway. I wanted her to learn that we never repay disrespect with disrespect." Many employees wiped tears from their eyes. Even the senior managers who had laughed at Daniel in the lobby could no longer hide their shame. They realized the greatest lesson had not come from a business seminar or leadership conference. It had come from a little girl quietly watching how her father treated people who had treated him unfairly. Daniel then invited the receptionist to join him on the stage. Nervously, she walked forward, expecting to lose her job in front of everyone. Her hands trembled as she stood beside him. Instead of criticizing her, Daniel smiled kindly and said, "Yesterday you made a mistake. But mistakes do not define a person's future. What matters is what we learn from them." Tears rolled down her face as she whispered, "I'm so sorry. Mr. Brooks, I judged you without knowing anything about you." Daniel nodded warmly. "I forgive you, but don't apologize only to me. Promise yourself that from today onward, every visitor who walks through these doors will be welcomed with the same respect you would give the owner of this company." The receptionist nodded through her tears. "I promise." The audience immediately stood and applauded, not because someone had been punished, but because they had witnessed true leadership. Daniel believed that changing hearts was more valuable than humiliating people. Over the following months, Kingston Global transformed completely. Every employee, from executives to interns, completed new leadership and customer care programs centered on respect, humility, and compassion. Reception staff welcomed every visitor with genuine warmth. Managers learned to listen before making assumptions, and employees began treating cleaners, delivery drivers, and job applicants with the same dignity they showed company executives. The culture of the organization changed so dramatically that Kingston Global became known as one of the most respectful workplaces in the country. Business magazines praised the company not only for its financial success, but also for the values that shaped its people. Daniel continued to avoid the spotlight, choosing instead to spend most of his time raising Sophie while quietly guiding the company behind the scenes. Whenever employees asked him the secret to his success, he always gave the same answer: a business grows because of people. If you value people, success will follow. Years later, many employees still remembered the quiet single father who waited patiently in the lobby without revealing who he was. They often shared the story with new staff members as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that every person deserves kindness regardless of their position, wealth, or clothing. Daniel never cared whether people recognized his face. What mattered most to him was knowing that his daughter had watched him respond to disrespect with patience, humility, and grace. For Daniel Brooks, that was the greatest achievement of all, because the most valuable signature he ever placed was not the one on millions of paychecks, but the example he left in the hearts of everyone who worked at Kingston Global. Story lesson: never judge a person by their appearance, because you never know their true story. Kindness and respect cost nothing, but they can change someone's life forever. True leaders inspire people through humility, forgiveness, and the example they set.